Hi, everybody. Today's Friday, December 19th, 2025, and our dear friends, Colonel Wilkerson and Larry Johnson, are here with us. Welcome back, Colonel and Larry.
Yeah, always good to be with you on a Friday morning.
Yep.
Let me start, Colonel, with you. And European Union is trying to do everything right now. They're talking about how to send more money to Ukraine. They're talking about giving Ukraine a loan that is not from the Russian assets, but they're not going to take it back until Russia pays, for reparation of Ukraine. How likely is that, in your opinion? I don't see Russia paying Europe for what they're paying to Ukraine.
Nor do I. And the people who ought to be paying, of course, are NATO leaders and Washington in particular with empty pockets, but we act like we don't have empty pockets. What I'm hearing that is extremely disconcerting is that leaders like Starmer, Macron, and Merz, and particularly the latter, are planning on using, and this really frightens me with regard to Germany, I truly mean that 5% that's coming in for defense to not only rescue very weak and even struggling economies, particularly in Germany, but to reinvigorate them with defense spending. And the CEO of Rheinmetall the other day essentially came out and said, I'm going to catch Lockheed Martin and Grumman with a gleeful smile on his face. I don't need to go very far to tell you what that means in my mind, at least. I've lived a long time historically. I think that's very dangerous. And then the second thing I'm hearing, which I think is very dangerous, is that having observed what the United States is doing with respect to Venezuela, particularly piracy on the high seas, I would call it, taking a tanker, that there are people in the European members of NATO right now who are seriously talking about doing something like that in the Baltic. And they've even used words like that would be an Article 5 event. That's very disturbing.
Yeah. Larry, your take on Europe and the behavior of Europe. We know that there is a lot of talks right now in Europe about Russian assets.
Uh, they could take a picture of them, record them, and then put them in a medical journal as a perfect illustration of insanity on display. I mean, it is so divorced from reality, yet in their delusions and in their fixation on Russia, this enemy they've created in their mind, they're literally sinking their societies. And look at Germany in particular is the one that's so puzzling.
Yeah.
That they have, they're destroying their industry. They're and the European leaders are insisting that they must pay more for gas and oil instead of less. The and look, it's one thing to make these threats against Russia, and Russia is taking them seriously, as it was evidenced today. Putin did his traditional year-end press conference, and he made a point that that Russia can't sit there and ignore the fact that Starmer and Macron and Merz are talking about going to war, attacking Russia, and so Russia is preparing accordingly. But for them to say that, but then not have the infrastructure in place, not have the industrial foundation needed to sustain a modern war, not having the advanced weaponry required to have any chance of prevailing against Russia, and then the complete lack of any casus belli. Russia has not been out interfering in the European elections. It's just the opposite. Russia hasn't been threatening to invade Europe. Just the opposite. So, um, all we can conclude is this is like a temporary insanity on their part. But I think the combination of economic uh, disintegration that's taking place will ultimately rein them in. They won't be able to continue this. You saw today, the EU had been pushing to steal the Russian assets, use that, give it to Ukraine as if the money's going to make a difference. And they finally said, okay, no, we're just going to go out on the international market and borrow this money and give it to Ukraine. It's just, it makes absolutely no sense.
Takes you back to the old aphorism we came up with the other day. Yeah, I reminded you of it, that America was going to give weapons it doesn't have to the Europeans for money they don't have, to the Ukrainians for soldiers they don't have. That sums it up.
Carl, I think the point that Larry was mentioning is important. The strange behavior of Germany. Do you see the German chancellor representing the German people, or he's representing BlackRock?
I'm going to compare two historical moments with you. The one I know quite a bit about, the other I'm learning about. One was when Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush and Colin Powell and Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl and Maggie Thatcher and John Major and a host of others, including Gorbachev, were talking seriously about the reunification of Germany and its retention in NATO. Helmut Kohl, a very astute German in my view, was very worried. He lusted for that's not too strong a word, for the move of Bonn to Berlin. He loved the idea of all Germans being in a single state again. He was very aware of the significant meaning of that move to Moscow. And he was very leery of making it for that reason. The only reason that I saw, and I wasn't privy to all the discussions, but I did get back briefings from Powell on most of them, when he saw that the United States was serious in his mind about not going an inch further east with the NATO alliance, that pretty much sold him on it. And he was having a problem with the $80 billion his own people, U.S., were telling him it would cost. And of course, ultimately, it cost twice that much. But that was a very serious German. Merz is not a very serious German. Merz is a mercantile globalist, is what Merz is. And that's why I said what I said about Rheinmetall and about this business of building Germany's economy back on the back of the defense industry. Very disturbing, because he's the kind of individual that would actually do that if he could get away with it. Now, I don't think for a moment, I hope I'm right, he's going to get away with it, because the German people are not going to buy that. And that's going to put him out of office pretty quickly. Then you have to consider, has he started this momentum, and has the German industry caught hold in a way that it wants to continue, because it does see it resurrecting itself to a certain extent, and the AfD takes charge. And you suddenly get an AfD energized to stay in power and sees that as a political mechanism to do so, because it is making the German economy look a little better. That's dangerous, I think.
Well, and just let me just add in there the real problem that's manifest in Germany and repeated in the UK and France. You don't have a majority party, a political leader in any of those countries. They're all minority coalitions. So this speaks to the fact that there is no consensus about what to do going forward. And so in that circumstance, it's sort of like the person that shouts the loudest gets the most attention. Doesn't mean they have the most support, but they do get the most attention.
And I would add to that, Nima, you may have seen the piece that talked about Staatsräson, what we mean by raison d'etat, or reasons of state, that Germany is trapped in this sort of Staatsräson with regard to the Holocaust. It can't get out of it. It seems to be unable to shed it, and it's making current strategic decisions based with regard to Israel in particular, but the whole situation in general. It's making decisions based on its guilt and its consciousness of that guilt made into raison d'etat, which is ridiculous. I don't want to see them do that with, as I said, with this arms buildup, which is, I think, coming. I do think it's coming.
Larry, here is what Keir Starmer said yesterday to the British people.
Putin's appetite for conflict and for chaos is already there, and it will only grow. And Russia is already menacing our skies, our waters, our streets, and our national security.
Yeah.
I mean, God, how could nothing that he said was true, but he says it and believes it. That's what's so shocking. What has Russia done to the crime level on the streets in the UK? In fact, it was Keir Starmer who, as a prosecutor, declined to prosecute Pakistani rape gangs that were raping British women. Looks to me like it was more Keir Starmer who was the big threat to the UK, not Vladimir Putin. Good God.
Neiman, it reminds me of when Tony Blair, for God knows what reason, except that he was really worried about getting the vote for the second resolution in the parliament, even though he had a massive majority at that time, goes out and proclaims that Iraq could hit London in 45 minutes. You know what? Condi Rice called Colin Powell and said, "Where the hell did he get that?"
Yeah.
It was such a ridiculous statement.
But Carl, they can make that argument toward Russia. We know what's going on with these sort of rhetorics in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in France. But if they take decisions based on these, propaganda machine, and they're talking about, last week they were talking about the preemptive attack on Russia if they decide to attack us.
Well,
They know they cannot fight Russia without the United States. What if they go in that direction in order to bring the United States in?
I did a podcast yesterday with a gentleman who was asking me a similar question. And I mentioned the fact that I had at that time just heard the fairly powerful rumor that there were certain people talking about an Article 5 incident that would cause the United States to commit, and obviously cause others in NATO to solidify around it if it did. And that's the kind of thing that I think is extremely disturbing because, as Larry pointed out, they aren't anywhere near ready for that. And they're counting on the big guy to be ready for that. And I got news for them. They hadn't been checking their sticks very much.
Yeah.
The United States is not ready for that in any way, fashion, or form, especially not against a battle-hardened military with a revived and very well-functioning industrial base in Russia. It's, as Larry said, it's insanity.
Well, and I can't emphasize enough that all of these kinds of statements by Merz, Starmer, even the ones from Trump, they're designed to try to shape public opinion and to try to get public opinion to the point where it will support bellicose, belligerent acts by any of those countries. And that was driven home to me last night. I get there's a group of guys in the neighborhood where I live, and we have there's sort of a town square, and so we meet and smoke cigars. So two of the guys are Vietnam vets. One worked with U.S. Army intelligence for years after getting out of the service, and we were joined last night by a sort of a new fellow, and he's in the world of finance. So we're not talking to somebody who's somebody who's supposed to be familiar with world events, because when you're managing financial issues, you can't just stay local. And man, he was repeating all of the talking points about Russia being basically a communist state, an economy that is collapsing. And I just sat there and I said, that's bullshit. I said, you are repeating. I got to learn to be calmer in these situations. But this is not a stupid man. Just to underscore to me that the effectiveness of the propaganda to paint Russia as this menacing threat. I mean, because this guy was saying, yeah, Russia is out meddling in all these other countries. And I said, stop. Where? And then he starts struggling, trying to say where. And then when you start pointing out some inconvenient facts about NATO pushing to the east and NATO, in fact, I asked him, I said, would you be okay if China and Russia formed a military alliance with Mexico and started conducting annual military exercises? Well, he goes, absolutely not. I said, great. Then you understand Russia's point. No, it's different.
It's always different for the empire.
So that's what we're up against.
And Larry's right about the propaganda. It is everywhere. It's everywhere. As I was talking about Germany and Staatsräson, well, a big part of our raison d'etat right now, reason of state, reason to exist, is Russophobia. It's all across the country. You go to Texas, you go to California, you talk to people, and as Larry said, they don't know what they're talking about, but they know they don't like Russia. And they know that Russia is interfering in everybody's elections, and they know that Putin is a scoundrel. And they think he's sitting on top of a make-believe kingdom, that it'll collapse at any minute.
Yeah.
It's astonishing how many Americans believe that. Of consequence, Americans, business executives, financiers, who believe that for whatever reason.
Yeah, and that's why I say that there's no chance that of a peace agreement of Russia agreeing with the United States and letting Trump take the glory, because let's just assume Trump is able to get an agreement with Russia that Russia is willing to live with. I don't think that's possible, but let's just make that assumption. The political class and the public, the vast public attitude wouldn't support it. The only way it would happen is if Trump negotiates a deal with Russia, signs a treaty, that treaty is submitted to the U.S. Senate and the Senate approves it. And that's the only scenario in which there can be a negotiated diplomatic settlement to this war. Without that, there will not be an agreement that's worth the paper it's written on.
And you better believe that Lindsey Graham would stand on his toes and filibuster and everything else to stop that from happening. Takes a 2/3 vote. So,
yeah, there's a lot of money at stake for him.
Yeah, and I fear others too.
Yes,
we do.
Yeah.
Colonel, Putin today, he had a program in Russia, they call it, and Putin's direct line. He was talking with the people in Russia, answering the question, the public opinion, just communicating with the Russian people. And he said that Ukraine is not prepared for peace. And this somehow is in line with what Larry just said. And the United States is seeking for a immediate solution for the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is not going to have an immediate solution. They have to learn how to communicate, how to get along with each other. Basically, I would say Europeans and Russia. And we are not there anymore. We're not there, and you don't see the Trump administration trying to do anything in that direction, unless talking directly with Russians, sending Steve Witkoff with Kushner. What is your understanding of that?
My understanding is that Witkoff and Kushner and others represent Trump's wishes, and those wishes are money. And that's all there is to it. And he understands how much money would accrue were he to reestablish economic relations with Moscow. He is prepared to go over Europe's head, around their flank, or through their dead bodies if he has to. I'm not sure that he understands what that means, but I think he's prepared to do that. Will he, however, have the support of those within his own domestic circle, like Marco Rubio and others, to do that and to force it to happen? And what will it mean for U.S. relations with Europe? Now, footnote that with the fact that NATO is already moribund. NATO needs to go away. It won't for some time to come, but it needs to go away. The most dramatic move in that regard could be Erdogan actually fulfilling one of his, off-the-cuff remarks and unanchoring the southern flank and suddenly making NATO really moribund. I mean, instantly. And not only that, but not declaring some sort of or practicing some sort of neutrality, but noticeably putting his flag with this inexorable movement of power towards the east. That would be a dramatic moment that would make all this conversation moot. I think Trump is prepared, though, ultimately, if he can pull it off politically, to disregard the Europeans, throw Zelensky on the garbage heap, and have a deal with Russia. Now, how he handles that with his base will be anybody's guess, because I'm not sure his base is lined up with that objective. But we see what he's doing with the Epstein scandal. That's partly what Venezuela is about. The scandal's getting worse and worse every day. And Venezuela is a wagging the tail, dog wagging, whatever the hell the aphorism is. Same thing Bill Clinton did with Serbia when he was involved with Monica Lewinsky. And I do think that part of the problem there is he's looking at the polls and states like Alabama, states like Indiana, and even he, in his, I think, somewhat diminished form now, is figuring out that his coalition is falling apart. The Kirk assassination might be said to have started it dramatically, but now it's for other reasons. It's for affordability. You've got real problems in Alabama with people contemplating what their health insurance is going to be like 1 January. If you've seen the stats on it, it's hundreds of thousands of Alabamans. And this is not good for MAGA. So all of this domestic politics is such an important part of foreign policy and security decision-making now, usually negatively. And with this administration, put a line under that negatively, that I don't know where this is going, and I'm not sure Trump does either, really, and that's disquieting. One of the reasons Susie Wiles came out and did that interview, I think, is she is trying to establish some cover for herself, because she, amongst very few others, understands what's happening to them.
Yeah. Larry, your take.
Well, I would add, I think actually Susie Wiles has been part of the problem. And I'm not excusing, Trump's daft behavior, but when she admits that, she was one of the ones blocking release of the Epstein files, and on other actions such as, helping Trump deliver on some of the promises he made about going after those who were responsible for Russiagate. So the chaos that's evident right now within the Trump administration is, it's only going to get worse. And unfortunately, Trump has, he doesn't have the ability to make personnel decisions that will, as part of a broader strategy to advance his administration. I mean, they continue all this happy talk about how great the economy's doing, and yet the polls are showing consistently people are upset. The inflation is much higher than the government's reporting. And I think I commented, said this to you in a recent one of our last conversations. I've got a couple of Rottweilers, and we buy these logs. They look like a giant package of sausage of hamburger meat. And about a year and a half ago, we were paying $12 for one of those. It's about 3 pounds of hamburger. Now it's up to almost $20, and so and that price it's gone from 16 to 20 in just the last 6 months. So you've got some real economic issues here in the United States, and instead you get Trump with this delusional nonsense about, oh, everything's great, we got the best ever, it's and when you've got a leader that's so out of touch with reality, and then enabled by a grand group of sycophants. And admittedly, this isn't unique to Trump. I mean, we saw the same with Obama and with Bush, but Trump has now taken it to a new level and willing to believe that he can kill anybody that he wants with no pushback.
Yeah. Colonel Dan Bongino is leaving the administration, the FBI.
Never did anything anyway, so now what's happening?
Yeah, you look at Dan Bongino and his position, during the Epstein file, and then the Charlie Kirk's assassination. And he said that he feels the guy who was, who's in prison right now, he killed Charlie Kirk. Somehow, when you look at the way that he's tweeting right now, he's putting his post on X, you feel that he somehow feels that how damaging this short period of time that he was in the FBI is damaging his public opinion, his public personality. He had a show, everyone respects him, and right now the people are considering him part of the establishment. That's why I think he's getting out of FBI. But it shows huge differences are happening within the Trump administration, and the people are not happy with what's going on in FBI.
Well, Nima, if you're a member of the Trump administration of some consequence, that means cabinet or just sub-cabinet, one level, or someone in an agency that's very exposed. Like, for example, people don't talk about this very much, but forestries and fisheries and such who are doing irreparable damage to the Pacific Northwest, for example. If you're one of those people, you don't have a future other than being a podcaster for the remnants of the MAGA crowd. That's all the future you have. Who would want any of these people? Who would want Scott Bessent? Who would not want Kristi Noem? Who would want Marco Rubio? Who would want J.D. Vance? Who would want any of them, really, for significant positions in a future government? That's my greatest concern for the two-party system and the Republicans. Democrats are broken, totally broken, but at least they're scratching around in the hustings trying to find some future. And I think they're going to get rid of people like Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer and a host of others, including Barack Obama. Now, Michelle's got some sense. I'd like to see them keep her, but Barack, they can get rid of him too. Bill Clinton, get rid of him immediately. They might survive, but how's the Republican Party going to survive Donald Trump?
Well, yeah, I'd put J.D. Vance in a different category, just simply if you saw his recent remarks where he had the audacity to suggest that being critical of Israel was not anti-Semitic. Now, that's one of the first sane things I've heard come out of the Trump administration on this point. But, there's a video clip that surfaced of Bongino before he went into government. He's being interviewed by this woman, and she said, "What cause is closer, most dearest to your heart?" And he said, "Israel." You can't make this up, and I wouldn't put it past that he's resigning to go back into the realm of podcast, and he'll pull down $7,000 an episode maybe from the Israeli government to try to counter the anti-Israel sentiment that is growing and spreading throughout the under 40 crowd. And for those of us in the over 60 crowd, it's spreading with me too. Okay. If Bongino thinks that he's going to go back out, because he was a popular podcaster before going in, he has alienated his audience. He's discredited himself. The things that they claimed that they were going to do, they haven't done at all. In fact, Bongino is directly implicated in covering up the Epstein case. He was, even before he was confirmed as a deputy director of the FBI, he was helping edit the information, blacking out. So he's directly involved with this cover up. And then I don't know did you see the podcast where, Stephen Miller's wife, Katie, I guess is her name. She did an interview with Kash Patel and his girlfriend. Oh my God. You talk about making your skin crawl. And this Kash Patel is a buffoon. He is. I used to think he actually had something on the ball. He'd been a lawyer at JSOC, and he was a point guy for Devin Nunes in investigating Russiagate. But man, his judgment is just appalling.
You're beginning to see some Trump complimentary people. That is to say, Trump picked people who were very much like him.
Yeah.
They're insane, insane, incompetent, garrulous, and not much of a future looking at them.
Yeah.
Here is, Carl, what Zelensky said yesterday.
United States have their policy. They don't see us in NATO. For now. Everything in our lives is for now. Maybe the position will change in the future. Maybe somebody will come to realize that strong Ukrainian army strengthens NATO, and not vice versa. Politicians change. Somebody lives, somebody dies. And it's life.
Somebody lives and somebody dies. Man making his own prophetic statement.
Yeah.
It seems that, by the way, that whatever is happening between Zelensky and Europeans, they're talking about we have to, let this time, the Trump administration's time in office pass, let it pass, and we're going to get someone in the United States that would support the position of Europe, the position of Ukraine. He's talking this way, in my opinion. He's talking about 2029. The code in Europe, they're talking about 2029, being prepared to fight Russia in 2029. And this is the code that I'm getting from Europe. What is your take, Carl, on that?
I think it's insane. I don't think that, first of all, you're going to last that long. So in that respect, bye-bye, Z. And second, I don't think the European, as Larry pointed out, he's absolutely right. These people are going to be gone. Merz, Starmer, Macron, they're all going to be gone. I wouldn't be surprised to see Rutte gone before this is over with. I wouldn't be surprised to see some real changes in the flag officers in Brussels, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a military disposition or predisposition, whatever, toward other policies than those being pursued right now, because they are not totally stupid, some of them anyway. I know some of them. And they know that the days are numbered for the alliance as the alliance conceives itself right now. Now, whether they can do some things to trim it and rework it and make it more enduring and lasting, maybe turning it into what it should be, a European security identity, eventually minus the transatlantic link, other than maybe the nuclear umbrella, even to the tone of getting rid of the nuclear weapons in France and Britain. That would be a very positive move. And it would unlimber NATO to become truly a European security identity. That assumes that the EU, bastard entity that it is going to survive. And it assumes that the unity that produced it is going to survive. I don't think so. I think we're looking more every day at a Europe that will look more like the 1930s. And we will be very hard pressed to keep that Europe in any way, fashion, or form in the Western sphere, if you will. But at the same time, we're going to be falling apart. We are already falling apart. Our debt is going to eat our lunch. $2 trillion interest payments within the next 5 years. $2 trillion. Our credit rating will be downgraded. Nobody will buy our notes, not even Americans. And we will be in deep kimchi trying to figure out how we're going to survive. So good luck with 2029, Mr. Z.
Yeah. And Larry, if that's the situation, how do you think that Donald Trump is communicating that? What the reality of what Colonel just said to us, is there anything of that sort being communicated between the United States and Europeans?
Well, I'd like to think that that Donald Trump sent a card to each of the European leaders, and they opened it up, and it was playing music. And the song it was playing was by Fleetwood Mac, Go Your Own Way, okay? that was sort of the message that was communicated out of the newly released national security strategy, which again I'm fascinated by the attention this has attracted. And Colonel Wilkerson's been at this game a little longer than me, but I don't ever recall any kind of attention paid to that document in previous presidencies. And I'm thinking back to 1985 when I was at the CIA and started paying attention. And within it, though, the message that was conveyed to Europe was basically, you're no longer really that important to us, and you've got your own problems that you need to fix. And that is just a follow-up from what J.D. Vance said at the Munich Security Conference. When was that? In February?
Yeah.
Which, the Europeans sat there in just stunned silence as they were getting, blasted, verbally blasted by J.D. Vance. So the notion that there is some sort of common bond between us and Europe, and really before it was with the UK, because when you go back to World War II, the reality is at least people from 13 of the European countries fought on behalf of the Nazis against the Soviets. So they were on the wrong side of history. And now here we are 80 years later, trying to pretend that we're all one big happy family moving forward to counter a Soviet threat that is now a Russian threat, and actually manufacturing it. But instead of this unity that we keep hearing about, we see the cracks developing. It's like you're standing on a semi-frozen lake, and all of a sudden the ice starts cracking under you and spreading out. That's not a good sign, because that means that ice is going to break and you're going to get plunged into the cold water. And I think that's an apt metaphor for what's going to happen to Europe, the EU, and NATO.
Carl, today Vladimir Putin was asked about the behavior of the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself. On one side, they try to negotiate with Russia. On the other hand, they're putting a lot of sanctions on Russia. And we know that 12 hours ago, additional 8 tons of military supplies were transported by the Pentagon on board a commercial Boeing from Dover Air Base in Poland, to support the Ukrainian armed forces. These are not the signs, positive signs for Russians. And who's going to believe, after all, people want to know the outcome of what's going on, not just talks, not just the position of the President of the United States. Do you see any sort of outcome coming to the negotiating table to be practical for Russians?
First of all, 8 tons of military equipment is minuscule. It's nothing. Depends on what it is, of course. If
it's 80, Carl.
Well,
80 tons.
80 is still minuscule, unless it's Tomahawks or Attackums or something like that, which I doubt very seriously it is, because we don't have enough of those for us. And we're down in Venezuela spoiling for a war. No, it's not a lot of equipment, and I doubt very seriously that I would say it probably will not get into a position where it will make a damn bit of difference in the battlefield situation. So I'm not pro or con for that. It's a minuscule attempt to shore up Ukraine, and short of putting the Turkish military on the front lines and bolstering it with every other country that is a member of NATO, to include the United States land forces, you're not going to make any impact on the situation in Ukraine. You're just going to make it drag on longer, where you do the latter and put that many forces there. That's how badly the correlation of forces, as the Soviets used to say, stacks up miserably for our side, if you will, though it's increasingly not the United States' side. Thank God.
Yeah, but there's such a disconnect with the reality on the ground in Ukraine, and then what U.S. policymakers and officials are saying. And this was highlighted this week with an article. Cy Hirsch has put out a new piece on his Substack. And look, Cy's an old friend. I mean, I've known him since 1980. He's a little pissed at me right now because, I called him out on this article. It's complete nonsense. But it is not. Cy was not the one spinning the nonsense. What is alarming about this article is Cy has good sources. He was talking to officials in the Trump administration that are involved with the negotiations, and the crazy stuff that they were saying. It would, I could only conclude that this is what they're getting from the CIA, and they're going. Let me just pull up here for a second. I want to read you a couple of these quotes that these officials were making. One said, "Putin is staying afloat by borrowing money from Russian banks that are not permitted to lend to the population." I'm going, what? In fact, Russian banks are fully allowed to make loans to Russian citizens and are doing so at a very large rate. But to have that kind of statement come out from the mouth of these officials means that this is what the intelligence community is telling them. And the reason that's happening is, I pin it all on John Brennan as the primary instigator of this. When Brennan was CIA director under Obama back in 2015, he set up what are called mission centers. And these mission centers bring together the analysts and the operations personnel and then all the other support staff. And on paper, so, well, that's a good idea. Everybody working in the same direction. No, that's not how it works. You want to keep the analysts separate from the operations people, because the operations people are like car salesmen that have to meet a quota. And by God, they're going to sell. They don't care what they have to do, what lies they have to tell. They're going to sell it. And if you, the analyst, are the one out said, well, actually, that automobile that you're claiming only has 10,000 miles on it, that's actually 110,000 miles because the odometer turned over. And they get upset with you. Back on March 12th of 1988, I was down on Capitol Hill briefing a group of congressmen, along with the military analysts from the Nicaragua branch, and we were accompanied by the chief of operations from the director, from the DO, from the Central American Task Force, a guy named Armstrong. A whole story about him. But in the midst of this briefing, we also had the branch chief for the Nicaragua branch on the analytical side with us. He gets called out, comes back in and says, "Oh my God, we just got news that the Sandinistas have invaded the southern part of Honduras called the Salient and have overrun the Contra camps and are killing them. It's a massacre." And oh boy, the members of Congress erupted. This is outrageous. And so as we got up to head back to CIA headquarters, this Central American Task Force military chief starts berating me and the Nicaraguan military analysts because we had undermined the Contra effort because of our analysis was not supportive. Well, got back to headquarters and I said, okay, show me the actual, what's the intelligence? And it was an NSA intercept, and it reported that a Contra patrol had a skirmish 15 kilometers from the Contra base with a Sandinista patrol. Little bit different story. Before they were telling us like this was the Contra version of the Alamo with the Sandinistas as the Mexicans swarming over the wall, crushing the Contras. Is anything but. but because we were, I was over on the actual opposite side of CIA in the building. I was on the northern wing, and the DO was on the southern wing. They couldn't come in and berate me and pressure me every day to conform, be a team player, support the program. That's exactly what's going on right now. The Ukrainian Russian analysts are in one of these mission centers where the priorities of carrying out the covert operations against Russia and the covert support for Ukraine, that's the priority. And by God, no analyst is going to be allowed to tell the truth about what's actually going on. And they, as a result, they continue to brief this nonsense that Russia is on the ropes, that Putin is under. One of the things that Psy sources told him was that Putin is facing increasing political, economic, and military opposition in Moscow, and that the Russian military is in, quote, serious disarray. And I wrote Psy. I said, Psy, I've had conversations with more than 40 different Russian officials, political leaders from different political parties, businessmen, military personnel. I said, that's all crap. None of that is true. He didn't like to hear that, but it's unfortunate. But this is an example of this. The lies that are told by the intelligence community, they become so deeply embedded in the public consciousness that we are making policy based on lies.
Neiman, let me just say that everything Larry just said, would that have been Fulton Armstrong?
Well, yeah, no, Fulton was actually, he was my predecessor as the Honduran analyst.
Yeah.
And then he was my initial mentor in my first year on the account. But yeah, Fulton and I are old friends.
What I was going to say is Larry just described almost letter for letter, chapter and verse, hour by hour of what they did to Colin Powell in preparing for the 5 February 2003 UN presentation. They mixed operations and analysts and did so throughout. And you could watch it happening. Unfortunately, I was not allowed to take Tom Finger or even Carl Ford over with me to the agency because my boss thought he knew what they thought and didn't need them and thought himself powerful enough to stop this sort of thing from happening. He learned he wasn't.
Yeah.
And I had no intelligence professional with me to challenge what was happening in front of me. But I was enough of an intelligence user over the past 40 years or so that I understood a little bit about what Larry's saying as to what was happening. And apparently it ain't changed a bit.
It's gotten worse, actually.
Yeah. Let me put a clip of Belgian Prime Minister today comparing the West, basically Europeans to Russians, with Russians.
It's about Russian claims in Russian courts. They will not be executable in the European Union. That's also something we're quite clear on. Because Russia is not a rule of law state. If they want to seize assets in Russia, they probably will. And they can launch a lot of litigation. That's a form of intimidation. They have many forms of intimidation. The hybrid warfare of Russia with the drones and the cyber attacks and the damaging of critical infrastructure and the litigation. That's all part of an intimidation scheme. And we're not going to back down for that. That plays in my head no role. And I don't give them a very good chance against Euroclear because Euroclear stays exactly in line with international law. If you go to war, your sovereign assets are immobilized until the end of the war, and then there's a peace treaty, and then there is a settlement on this. This has happened before in history. We're still in chartered waters. The things we do with the windfall profits, that's the chicken with the golden eggs, that's also legally very sound. We're very certain that Euroclear is now within international and financial law.
It's unbelievable,
Yeah.
as though whatever they're doing is based on the international law, but what Russia is doing is totally against it.
Well, just think about the tapestry behind him while he's saying that. Is he an ignorant fool or what? Think about the tapestry behind him. We are destroying, indeed, I think we have destroyed the international law that remnants of which still existed in the world. We've destroyed it. Look at what we're doing in the Caribbean. Look at what Israel's doing in the Levant. There's no international law left. We just sanctioned the prosecutors at the ICC again, double down on the sanctions. Who's destroyed international law, Mr. EU dude?
Yeah.
Larry, the case of Venezuela, shifting the gear a little bit, what's going on? And do you think that it's all some sort of show because of the Epstein file? What is Donald Trump experiencing in the United States in terms of domestic policy and the base, the MAGA movement? Or they're going to attack Venezuela after all?
They may ultimately attack, but
Tucker said, Larry, sorry for interrupting. Tucker said that they're going to attack. He was hearing from people.
But he heard that Trump was going to announce that on Wednesday night. Now, Trump is supposed to make another announcement today at 1:00, but we just step back and say we're going to use force against Venezuela to accomplish what? That is the critical question. Just being able to punch somebody doesn't translate into achieving any particular objective. There are limits to U.S. power. The U.S. really only has two main options. Well, three. Option one, use air power to bomb, quote, strategic sites throughout Venezuela. That'll bring them to their knees. Well, we know that's not true. We saw it in World War II. Didn't work. Didn't work with the war against Iraq in 2003. Didn't work against Vietnam. So this is just the wild sexual fantasy of Air Force officers. Okay, and they live in this fantasy world. Option two, put in conventional forces to seize territory. All right. Well, Venezuela is, as I've said before, 3 times the size of Vietnam. And we had trouble seizing and controlling Vietnam with 543,000 soldiers back in 1969. We don't have that number in the U.S. Army right now. If we cobble together every single warm body in the world, we still wouldn't come up with more than 470,000. So the third option, and actually this is what I've been told, this is what's underway. The U.S. Special Operations Forces are trying to conduct a number of attacks, sabotage, other activities inside Venezuela. But as I was fortunate to be mentored by 2 crusty former colonels, one a Marine colonel and one an Army colonel who actually, he was reported, supposedly wrote JOPES, this entire manual about joint operations planning, etc. And they both made points about the limitations of the special operations forces. They're good at, rescuing people. They can do that. They can conduct a specific raid, but they can't go and hold territory. They don't go in and secure an area. They can't carry out the kinds of missions that conventional military forces are supposed to. So here's Trump using all these different threats to try to coerce Maduro into leaving. And then the CIA is working behind the scenes trying to pay off enough generals to betray Maduro. So once you get past that point, no matter who you install as president in Venezuela, they're not going to have legitimacy. And there are enough Venezuelans with weapons that have easy access to get back and forth across the borders with Brazil and Colombia, that you're setting up a massive insurgency that will then be accompanied, I believe, if the United States pursues this course of action, with sabotage of the oil fields, because any attempt by the West to take control of those is going to elicit attacks from within. So this is, maybe this is all a diversion to keep. Actually, I think the real intent is to try to limit the power of China and China's influence in Venezuela. But again, it's not going to work because we've already exposed the weakness of the United States. Yeah, we can put out a lot of big ships. Yeah, we can fly some planes around. We look powerful, but the Houthis exposed our weakness. And the technology and missile technology has changed the equation. Where we once had dominance, we no longer do.
Carl, how do you see the links between the case of Venezuela and the case of the Middle East? Some people may say that the United States wants to, if something happens in the Middle East, Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz, and maybe in the Red Sea they're going to influence, the Bab al-Mandab, with the Houthis. So how can the United States balance the energy market? That would be Venezuela. Venezuela coming in would somehow balance the market. Is that somehow related to the case of the Middle East, or can be related to what's going on in the Middle East, or maybe the new war between Iran and Israel?
If there's any fundamental strategic interest behind Trump and the administration's moves with regard to Venezuela, I have to assume that it's the 300 billion barrels of oil and all that means, from challenging the attempt by other countries in the world to denominate world oil sales in other than the dollar, which would be catastrophic for us, or just wanting that oil because Venezuela has it and it's our oil, as Trump has said. Doesn't matter what the reasons are, really, that if that's the fundamental purpose of this, I think it's going to fail. I really think it's going to fail for reasons that Larry just enumerated. And let's back up for a second to 1992, I think it was, when H.W. Bush asked Dick Cheney to have Colin Powell, informed by the Joint Staff, come over to the Oval Office. Cheney accompanied him as Secretary of Defense and briefed the president on what it would take to calm down, if not achieve some sort of victory in Serbia and environs. Powell went over after an exhaustive look, terrain analysis, everything else with regard to the Joint Staff, which, by the way, let me mention, had become, because of Goldwater Nichols, the best general staff on the face of the earth. I would compare it with the German general staff immediately prior to and during the opening stages of World War II. It was crisp. It was the top 10% of every service's officers. That's what Goldwater Nichols had done. Powell knew that. He used that staff. He used it the way it should be used. He went over and told President Bush, 500,000 troops start. What? UNPROFOR only had 40,000 out there. 500,000 troops, Mr. President, and it might take more than that. So we should have another 250,000 in reserve ready to go. That's what the terrain analysis shows us. That's what the tenacity of the opposition shows us. That's what we need to go away victorious in any way, fashion, or form. Needless to say, the president said, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Go back to the Pentagon and cease planning. Well, we didn't cease planning. You never do that. But that's, tell you what, Venezuela's the same problem, maybe even larger. I took a good look at the map. I've got this big atlas that gives you everything that you wanted to look at. I took a good look at it last night. You want to talk about Vietnam times 10, maybe not the tenacity of the Asians. I'll give the Asians credit. They're much better soldiers than most people in the Western Hemisphere from any country, including our own. They are really superb soldiers. They're not that clever with regard to strategy unless you get up to Jap and Ho Chi Minh himself, and then you had a pretty astute strategy. But down at the bottom level, you are fighting them to the death. I mean, to the death. Khaki-clad, Red Star wearing NVA or Viet Cong, for that matter. You're not going to have that kind of tenacity, I don't think, in Latin America. But you are going to have all the other problems and a degree of tenacity. So you're going to lose. You are going to lose in any one of those scenarios that Larry just gave you, which are probably the only three that really matter and the only three that the Pentagon's looked at. You're going to lose. So why would you do this? That's my fundamental question. Why would you do this? Unless you're bluffing. Unless you're bluffing and you hope at the end of the day, the bluff pays off in an agreement with Maduro that is a win-win for both sides. Because otherwise, you're in trouble. You're in big trouble. And you're already in trouble. You're already in trouble from one end of the world to the other.
Larry, do you think that the mercenaries, if they go underground, they have to confront mercenaries from other countries in Latin America?
Well, we actually have a good case study, if you will, next door in Colombia. Colombia has been fighting the FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias Colombianas, and the National Liberation Army, the ELN. Good Lord, 40, 50 years?
At least.
And despite, tons of U.S. military assistance and lots of financial assistance, Colombia's been unable to defeat those guerrillas, because the terrain is just too difficult, and you don't have them locked into a confined area. So Venezuela would actually, I think, be potentially much worse than what Colombia has experienced.
A lot more water.
Yeah. So this is, it just, again, it's the ignorance of the territory, ignorance of the people, ignorance of history that, I know a lot of Hollywood tends to present an image of the U.S. government, particularly the CIA, as a bunch of really smart people who, they understand the big picture and they got all the details in hand. No, I've always maintained the better, instead of Sean Connery and Pierce Brosnan, we get Dilbert. Okay. Dilbert is the more accurate portrayal of what the CIA is, particularly on the analytical side of the house. There is no incentive, particularly now, for analysts to tell the truth. And in fact, we the Washington Post reported, earlier this year in March, when the CIA put out a presidential daily brief that claimed that Russia was not really serious about the conditions that Putin laid out back in June of 2024. And the analysts at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research dissented. And a dissent means that they couldn't reach an accommodation or a compromise. So the CIA put out, this is what we believe, and the State Department analysts got to write a separate saying, well, basically we disagree and here's why we disagree. Well, that got to Trump, and Trump got upset and sent word back to INR that they fired those analysts. So, that's the reality. And a lot of these people that are, working as analysts, they're not independently wealthy. They've got obligations with maybe a mortgage or two. And, nobody wants to risk losing a job and having to get out on the job market and find, because, working at the CIA is actually pretty good money. So when you factor those human factors in, the truth becomes an easily expendable item.
Colonel, Israeli media reported that. Do you want to add something, Colonel?
I just wanted to say, I was thinking the whole time Larry was talking, how far we have come from that moment. I wish I could remember the dates, but my mind is going these days. Simon Bolivar was at the top of his game. And I even remember, I think that he was in Caracas, and the Marquis de Lafayette showed up with a letter from George Washington. And Bolivar said to the Marquis, "How honored I am to have the greatest champions of freedom on the face of the earth," because he had a letter from George Washington for Simon Bolivar. "You, my dear Marquis, and the man who wrote the letter." How far we have come from that day in South America.
Yeah.
Colonel, Israeli media reported moments ago that a senior Israeli official said to them that a new war in Lebanon is very likely. But, we know that somehow, strangely, seeing Israeli even attacking Tom Barak, who's supporting Israel. What is going on? And is there any sort of difference, some sort of gap widening between the Trump administration and Israelis?
Yes, I think so. There is. I think the word I'm getting is that we have cautioned him seriously about expanding the conflict in Lebanon, and he's just totally disregarded it. And I would say right off the bat, what do you mean resuming the war? It's never stopped. There's not a day gone by that he hasn't killed somebody in Lebanon or dispossessed somebody of their property or whatever. And I think I'm still convinced he's going to war with Iran. Absolutely convinced of it. So this might be their way of creating some kind of divisiveness or subterfuge, if you will, under which they'll do it. Or it might be the lead-in for that, because I do not think he's given up on the idea. I think he is still very much personally roiled by the fact that he got handed his ass for 12 days rather than what they're portraying it as. And he's going after them. And I think that was a prelude to it, that speech he gave about the water. He's talking that way in a propagandistic way because he still thinks that the bulk of the Iranian people, or at least a considerable portion, will rise up and welcome him as the conqueror. And not for a minute do I think he's going to try to cross into Iran with ground forces, but I do think he's going to resume the conflict. And I think Iran's going to hand him his rear end. And then to me, that's the end. That's the end for Israel, because we're not going to then bail him out. I could be wrong. Donald Trump might prove me wrong and do it. But then what is the bailout? It might be a bail-in. It might be the United States committing the same error that Israel just committed to get them to come in. So God knows. I mean, we've got all kinds of scenarios across the face of the earth right now that could end the empire much more precipitously than I first thought.
Yeah. Larry, do you feel the same way, or you somehow feel that, Trump would learn or has learned from what has happened between the United States and Yemenis?
Repeat that again. Trump did what? You're saying Trump learned? No. Do you know a different Donald Trump than I do? There's no learning.
He's too busy writing new inscriptions underneath the pictures of the presidents in the White House.
Oh my God. The notion that Trump is playing some sort of 3D chess, I think, is completely laughable. He does read polls, and he is uniquely terrible at selecting personnel to work for him. That normally you'd think if you're in that kind of position as a CEO, as the boss, as the top guy, you want people around you that are competent, that have good judgment, that you recognize you don't know everything, and that you have to have people who have expertise in different areas, that they know more than you, and you've got confidence in their judgment. Well, none of that applies to Trump. I mean, like Pete Hegseth is, the Secretary of Offense. I don't want to call it. It's not defense, and I'm not going to call it war. So he's just offensive. Okay.
He's the Secretary of the Warrior ethos.
But he's got no real depth of experience, and he's not demonstrated good judgment even in his personal life. So and you need somebody that can explain militarily what is capable and not capable if you're going to use military force. Trump has no depth with the law, and therefore he sees, he's like the average American reading a Tom Clancy novel. Hey, it's okay to kill the bad guys. It's okay to torture them to get like that TV show 24. There's always about every episode they're torturing somebody to get information needed to save lives. So the message that was sent, we can do whatever we want as long as we have a good goal as our primary objective. And so, here he is killing now close to 100 people that hadn't fired a shot on the U.S., but we justify it, we excuse it because we say they're bad people. So Trump is he is right now, particularly with respect to Venezuela, with respect to Israel, with respect to Iran, with respect to Russia, he's putting out a lot of dry straw that could be easily ignited, and he doesn't have a firefighting plan in mind.
I would point out too, Nima, that the Secretary of War had a prayer meeting on the central courtyard of the Pentagon a couple of days ago, at which Franklin Graham, who previously was not allowed to come in and speak the way he wanted to the soldiers, sailors, air Marines, and others, to speak. In his words, with Hegseth sort of cheering him on, in his words, he talked about the Old Testament, and he talked about the God of the Old Testament and how that God had authorized the Israelites to kill men, women, and children, to eradicate them from the face of the earth. What was he talking about in terms of current events? And talking to the soldiers, sailors, and civilians and others who were assembled there. That's where we are with this guy. This guy is worse than a second lieutenant in charge of the Pentagon.
Yeah.
I think we're about to conclude that Donald Trump, the second term, Trump 2.0 is simply the same as Trump 1.0.
Worse.
Yeah, I'd agree with Larry. It's worse.
Worse.
Yeah.
At least there were some checks and balances, like Mattis, the Pentagon, and some of the chiefs of staff, whom he went through, 4 or 5 of. But they're at least people, I might not have liked their philosophies, but at least they had some sense. How do these people do?
Thank you so much, Colonel Wilkerson and Larry Johnson. Great pleasure.
Yeah, we get to start people's weekend depressed.
I forgot to say, Larry, when this podcast, so I forgot to say you just destroyed everything on the scene with your share.
It's my Santa shirt. You see Santa Claus?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
had to break out the Christmas cheer.
You need to be on a beach with a cerveza in your hand.
Yeah, with the drinking a Mai Tai.
Yeah, Mai Tai would be even better.
All right, thanks so much.
See you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.